1.
So, how did we get here? That's the main question we're trying to ask. We're trying to ask how the Black community got to where we are in our current place in history, and especially when viewing this through the lens of white supremacy and how that's impacted things like social justice, and especially the modern and historical incarnations of the wealth gap. So, when we're talking about this, we want to address first and foremost the original sins of America, so to speak. So, we're here to talk about the theft of land and especially the theft of people and how we're going to be honing in over the course of this presentation. How specifically these acts were not just acts that were perpetrated, but how they are protected by law, and the after effects of these things were protected by law long after they were either denounced or made illegal in the original acts themselves, and how they were justified by practice even when laws no longer applied, how they were continued to be maintained through social pressure and various other actions like that. So, to begin, we're going to talk a bit about the origins of slavery and the history of how that was first brought to the United States. Because it's obviously no secret how important slavery was to the foundation and the early history of the United States. However, the very specifics of how it started is actually something that may not be known by a great number of people. So the slavery practice in the United States was chattel slavery. That was a direct tie-in to the overall triangle trade, which was a European system of transatlantic slavery that had existed prior to the United States and various Caribbean and South American colonies, where you had slave labor, which were purchased or captured in Africa, that were then brought over to colonies in the United States and also South America and the Caribbean, especially. First and foremost, those two, and the United States would later follow suit. And then those raw goods would be harvested in the United States, whether that's cotton or sugar cane or things like that. Then those raw goods would be sent from the colonies to Europe, where it would be manufactured into completed goods. And then those completed goods would be sold across the world, traded, especially in the context of the triangle trade, things like weapons or manufactured clothing sold in Africa in order to purchase more slaves in order to keep the triangle trade going. And that's what completes the circuit of it. But specifically in the context of how this relates to the United States, we had a specific incident in 1619 where a Portuguese vessel was running low on supplies and was required to touch down and make port in Virginia. In order to get supplies and to pay for repairs to the vessel, the Portuguese sailors, the only collateral that they had on their vessel were African slaves. So this is before African slaves had been imported to the United States. And it started this trend. This is the first inciting incident, because before this, there wasn't any history or context to that in the 13 original colonies. But that changed. So these 350 African slaves were sold by their Portuguese slavers to the new Virginian Americans. And originally, there were laws and standards about how this would be treated, about their rights to have for the men to have wives, and if their children would be slaves. And at first, there was a much more significantly less chattel-esque lens on this, where the children of these slaves were not going to originally be enslaved, but very quickly only some less than a generation, decades in, that was seen to be no longer feasible, and strict laws separating these new black people that were imported to the Americas and white people were established, and that was much more in line with how future incarnations of African slavery would go in the United States. So it's important to understand how slavery plays into the history of the United States in general and to the origin of that to the 13 colonies. People generally think of the Deep South when they think of American slavery, and that's because that was the highest in terms of population. But all of the United States had a role in slavery, whether that be that use of slave labor. Even in the Northeast, there was use of slave labor to less of a population because their growing cycles were smaller, because the northern economy were much less crop driven and were more based on things like fishing and naval supply manufacturing, which were more skilled labor, but it still existed. And even beyond that, in terms of the smaller degree of slave labor, there was very high degree of slave importation. And especially cities in New England, such as Providence, Rhode Island, were some of the most prominent cities for importing slaves into the United States. So it's still a major hub for the overall institution of slavery, even though that may not be what people primarily think about when they think about American slavery. So, an important aspect when talking about the history of slavery and a big changing point in how it's adapted through American history was the Missouri Compromise in 1787, and specifically how it played a major role in the internal American government. Because at this point, a lot of the foundations that people generally start to envision when they think of American slavery had begun to take root. So you have the Deep South, and not even just Deep South, but the South in general. So this includes the Tidewater states like Virginia and Maryland. Southern states had a much higher population of slaves than the northern states for the reasons I had previously mentioned, which is just that it was more economically viable and slavery was an economic system. So because of that, slavery was a much higher portion of the culture in the South than it was in the North. And because of that, the population of people was definitely skewed in that sense too, where you had a large portion of the people in the South were African slaves at this point. And so when you factored in the populations and how that would weigh into seats in Congress in the United States, how that would weigh into matters of representation, they weren't counted because they were treated as chattel slaves or property. And so because of that, the northern states far heavily outweighed the the southern states in regards to these aspects of representation in government. So, in order to try to make a desperate bid to have more representation in government, the South sought to have a portion of slaves counted for their population. Now, obviously, when you think about it, the fact that they wanted to have African slaves count as a portion of the population, despite the purpose of representation in government being number of citizens, and obviously slaves weren't citizens, it's kind of laughable and also highly hypocritical that you'd want to count them for the sake of bettering themselves, but not count them for actually being counted for how citizenry is supposed to be, monitored in the context of the United States. But a compromise was met in order to appease these demands. And so it was treated that three-fifths of the population of African slaves would count towards the population overall in states. Here we have imagery that describes and really captures the spirit and the overall conditions of slavery, because something that is often overlooked is one, how old the technology of the photograph actually is. A lot of people seem to think that it's a more recent invention than it is. And in addition to that, which compounds the effect, a lot of people also distance slavery from the modern era. And so here are photographs taken of slavery in the United States in the South, and it really captures the conditions of how they were treated and kept. An important aspect to also take note of when you speak about American slavery is the very same sort of spirit of revolt and the spirit of revolution that also accompanies the stories of slavery all across the triangle trade, whether that be revolts to overtake slave castles and processing facilities on the continent of Africa, whether that's talking about slave revolts in the Caribbean, such as the Haitian Revolution, or slave revolts in Brazil, which was another massive hotbed for slavery in the transatlantic slave trade. And here we have listings of various revolts in the United States where African slaves were able to rise up and take military action to try to free themselves through armed action. Generally, the origins of these things would come from particular slaves that had degrees or backgrounds in education, whether this was literacy and a familiarity with organization based on positions that they've had in their pasts, and especially this is relevant to individuals that had military uh, history and education in their past, such as in the situation of the 1811 German Coast Uprising, where it was actually began and organized by two African slaves that were actually military officers in the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa. So it was taking these aspects of expertise in combat and organization and using those to try to continue to rise up and overthrow the yoke of their oppressors in these circumstances. So, an important aspect of slavery in regards to the legal system and how this would continue to play out in terms of a context being set was the Dred Scott case, where one of the most important quotes from said Dred Scott case is listed here, where you have the quote, "The black man has no rights which the white man was bound to respect." And this court case was a Supreme Court case and was one that was taken during slavery. However, it lays a bedrock and a foundation that's extremely important to go on to even aspects of the post slavery era and how that would play into how court cases would be settled, how certain issues would be viewed going on into the future.